when Serena Blackwell snapped her fingers at the banquet server, standing near the edge of the room. The gesture was so automatic, so practiced, that she did not bother to look at his face. She told him the help should know better than to linger near important conversations, then turned back to her executives and added the line that would follow her for the rest of her career. Men like you carry the trays. Women like me decide where the freight goes. Ethan Wyndham did not flinch. He set down the champagne flute with the same steady hand he used every shift, looked directly at Serena, and asked whether she still planned to be in the conference room at 9 the following morning to finalize the licensing agreement. Serena laughed out loud, certain she had embarrassed a nobody. She had not yet noticed that her own attorney, Lawrence Morrow, had just walked through the ballroom doors and was crossing the marble floor toward them with a face that had gone completely pale. Ethan Wyndham spent the hour before his evening shift the same way he spent most evenings, standing at his kitchen counter while his 14-year-old daughter Grace worked through a geography assignment at the table behind him. Grace Wyndham looked up from the map she was tracing and asked, almost without looking at him, whether he thought the deal would actually close this time. Ethan told her without turning around that nothing was certain until the ink was dry, and that the dollar amount attached to any agreement mattered far less to him than what the buyer intended to do with the technology once they had it. Grace made the small, familiar sound that meant she was only half convinced. She had grown up watching her father work two lives in parallel, without ever treating either one as less important than the other, and she had come to understand, even if she rarely said so, that the quiet stubbornness at his core was the same quality that had kept them both standing in the years since her mother died. 5 years earlier, after Patricia Wyndham lost her fight with cancer, Ethan had stepped away from a senior engineering position at a mid-sized tech firm and taken evening work at the Meridian Grand Hotel, serving banquets and corporate events. The medical bills had burned through most of their savings, and the schedule let him be at Grace's school pickup line 4 days a week without asking anyone's permission. He had started building TrueVector during those same months, not because he expected it to become anything significant, but because refining a freight routing algorithm on a laptop at 2 in the morning was the one activity that could hold his attention long enough to keep the grief from spreading into every corner of the night. TrueVector was a real-time logistics platform that reduced supply chain costs by modeling thousands of variables simultaneously, variables that every existing industry system consistently missed. By the time 3 regional carriers had quietly adopted early builds and begun tracking measurable results, the platform had already served its real purpose, which was carrying Ethan and Grace through the hardest years either of them would ever face. At the Meridian Grand, Ethan had built the kind of reputation that people rarely discuss, but always depend on. He took the complicated assignments, the tables where guests grew unreasonable, the events where the timeline shifted 3 times before the first course was cleared. He never once treated his uniform as something to be ashamed of, because he had never believed it was. Carol Delano, the hotel's event director and a close friend of Patricia's from years before the illness, pulled him aside early that evening to mention that the National Logistics Summit Gala had expanded to include a table of senior executives from Blackwell Freight Solutions, a last-minute addition seated in Ethan's section because 2 other servers had called out sick. Ethan glanced down the reservation sheet and recognized the name Serena Blackwell beside the lead reservation. Something settled quietly in his chest, because Serena Blackwell was the executive scheduled to finalize the TrueVector licensing agreement in a conference room 2 floors above the ballroom at 9 o'clock the following morning. He said nothing to Carol about the coincidence. He had insisted from the beginning of the negotiation that his connection to TrueVector remain undisclosed until the final time, specifically to prevent anyone at the table from treating him differently before the deal was done. Just before the gala began, Lawrence Morrow sent a short message confirming that the Blackwell board had approved the full $90 million licensing package, and that only Ethan's signature remained. Ethan slid his phone into his jacket pocket, straightened his collar, and looked up as the ballroom doors opened. Serena Blackwell walked into the National Logistics Summit gala the way she walked into every room, as though the space and the people inside it were already hers to arrange. She criticized the table placement before she sat down, sent back the first bottle of wine without tasting it, and demanded the ambient temperature be adjusted. Even though it had already been set to the specification her assistant had submitted the previous week. When Ethan approached to introduce the evening selections, Serena spoke across him to her chief operating officer, Xavier Trent, rather than acknowledging him directly, then handed off her wrap without looking at Ethan's face, the way someone disposes of something they no longer wish to carry. She ordered a dish the kitchen had run out of, and when Ethan explained that a comparable alternative was available, she announced to the surrounding tables that a server who told paying guests what they could not have was a server who had failed at the only task he was there to perform. She asked how long he had been in the industry, and before he could answer, she turned to Xavier and remarked, loudly enough for the adjacent table to hear, that a man who spent his 40s in banquet service had probably made a series of small, unambitious decisions and simply lost track of how many years had gone by. Xavier laughed. A second executive added something that turned Ethan briefly into a topic of casual entertainment for people who had never once needed a tip to make rent. Ethan had learned long ago that people who needed to diminish others rarely did it for a single reason. Underneath the irritation rising in his chest was a colder, more deliberate thought. That a woman this comfortable humiliating strangers in a public room would almost certainly apply the same contempt to the private decisions that affected people who had no way to push back. He kept his expression neutral and his hands steady, refusing to give her anything to work with. When a junior server nearby misread the seating arrangement and delivered the wrong appetizer to Serena's side of the table, Serena immediately requested that the young woman be removed from the event floor entirely. Ethan stepped in before the request could be processed and took responsibility for the error himself, absorbing the redirected frustration without argument. Later, when a small amount of water pooled near Serena's chair from a chilled carafe, she demanded Ethan address it personally, and at once, despite the fact that a floor attendant was already approaching with the proper equipment. Ethan handled it correctly, following procedure without hurrying in the way that would have satisfied her need for submission, or slowing in the way that would have given her cause to escalate. When Ethan gently corrected a factual claim Xavier made about routing inefficiencies, an error that happened to involve exactly the class of problem True Vector had been designed to solve, Serena's patience gave out entirely. She leaned back in her chair and said the sentence that would define the rest of the evening. "Men like you carry the trays," she said, at a volume the adjacent tables could not ignore. "Women like me decide where the freight goes. Do you understand the difference?" Ethan looked at her evenly and asked whether she still planned to sign the agreement in the morning. Serena laughed, assuming the server was performing some small act of theater to appear important in front of people who outranked him by every measure that mattered to her. She did not stop there. Over the next several minutes she remarked that a man of his age who had ended up in banquet service had likely exhausted every other option available to him, and that the composure she could read on his face was not confidence, but the practiced stillness of someone who had stopped expecting anything better. She called for Carol Delano and requested that Ethan be reassigned to a different section of the hotel, claiming the service at her table had been unacceptable from the moment she sat down. Carol listened to the complaint without reaction and told Serena that Ethan had done nothing wrong and would remain in his assigned section. Serena responded by noting that Blackwell Freight Solutions and its affiliated corporate accounts represented a meaningful portion of the Meridian Grand's annual bookings, and that Carol might want to weigh that relationship carefully before defending a server who had made the evening uncomfortable. It was at that moment that Lawrence Morrow crossed the ballroom floor. He had come to finalize a procedural detail about the morning signing, accompanied by Nina Radcliffe, Blackwell's general counsel. Lawrence spotted Ethan standing with a tray while Serena continued pressing Carol. Something in his expression collapsed from confusion into alarm in the space of a single step. He crossed directly to Serena's table and said the sentence that ended her evening. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, "the man you've been speaking to is Ethan Wyndham." The name registered on Serena's face about 2 seconds after the words left Lawrence's mouth. Nina Radcliffe opened the leather portfolio she was carrying, compared the identification photo inside it against the man standing in front of her, and felt the color leave her own face as the full weight of it landed. Serena insisted it had to be some kind of staged provocation. Ethan set down his tray and explained, without any change in tone or posture, that he had worked at the Meridian Grand for 5 years before True Vector was worth anything at all, and that he had not arranged a single detail of the evening in order to test anyone. What troubled him, he said quietly, was not the specific words she had chosen, but the belief underneath them, the belief that his uniform made him someone she was entitled to treat as less than fully present. Serena's expression shifted from contempt into negotiation within seconds. She offered to increase the total licensing package by $7 million as a gesture of good faith. She proposed a private settlement with no public record attached. She suggested that Xavier had set the tone at the table and offered to address that situation internally. She floated the possibility that the evening could be reframed as a misunderstanding produced by the pressure of a long conference schedule. Ethan declined every offer without hesitation. When Serena warned him that he would not find a comparable opportunity in the logistics sector for years, Ethan turned to Lawrence and asked him to send formal notice that Ethan Wyndham was withdrawing from negotiations with Blackwell Freight Solutions, effective immediately. The $90 million deal was over before a single signature had touched the final page. Before she left the ballroom, Serena leaned close enough that only Ethan could hear her, and told him he had just made the most expensive mistake of his professional life. By morning, Blackwell's communications department had released a statement describing an overconfident inventor who had abruptly walked away from a generous agreement in order to extract more money. Ethan's name spread across trade publications within hours, most of the coverage noting that he worked banquet service at a downtown hotel, framing True Vector as an amateur project whose estimated value had been wildly inflated. Serena made no mention of the gala. She told journalists that Blackwell had fulfilled every good faith obligation and was reviewing legal options related to bad faith negotiation conduct. Xavier Trent personally contacted 2 of True Vector's early carrier partners and warned them that Ethan's judgment had become erratic and that the withdrawal from the Blackwell agreement was unlikely to be an isolated decision. The Meridian Grand was hit almost as quickly. A wave of coordinated 1-star reviews appeared across booking platforms within a single afternoon, and 2 corporate accounts canceled standing reservations after receiving calls from Blackwell-affiliated contacts. Carol Delano, who had spent 11 years building the hotel's events business through consistency and personal relationships, now faced the possibility of revenue losses serious enough to force cuts she had spent years trying to prevent. Ethan watched the toll of it settle into Carol's face over the following days. The tightness around her eyes, the way she began arriving earlier and staying later, as though sheer effort could hold back something that had nothing to do with the quality of her work or the warmth of her staff. He remembered her sitting quietly in the back of the funeral home 5 years earlier, and afterward appearing at his apartment with food he hadn't thought to prepare for himself or Grace. She had never once treated his grief as a complication. The thought that his decision might cost her what she had spent more than a decade building pressed on something in his chest that he could not reason away. Grace noticed the shift in him, the long silences at dinner, the way he read his phone with the stillness that used to belong only to waiting rooms. She did not ask him to give in. She only asked once, quietly, whether he was sure about what he was protecting and who was being asked to pay the cost. Ethan did not have a clean answer. It was while reviewing Blackwell's full due diligence file, a document his legal team had been entitled to inspect, but had never been shown in its entirety, that Ethan found what he had not been looking for. Buried in an internal implementation appendix was a workforce projection. 4,500 driver positions to be eliminated within the first 18 months of True Vector deployment, framed throughout as an efficiency outcome rather than a policy decision. The further he read, the clearer the picture became. Blackwell's actual plan involved using True Vector's routing data to reclassify thousands of contracted drivers as unnecessary, dissolving their agreements automatically by flagging routes as redundant, rather than through any individual human review. The worker protection clauses Ethan had specifically negotiated into the draft. Clauses designed precisely to prevent the algorithm from being used to justify terminations without case-by-case cause, had been quietly removed from the version presented to the Blackwell board. Serena had known about the removal and had approved it. If Ethan had signed the agreement as it was written, True Vector would have become the instrument used to strip thousands of people of their livelihoods, while Blackwell described it as a technology initiative. The appendix was an internal planning document. Serena's name did not appear directly beside the clause removal. Ethan sat with that gap long after Lawrence had gone home, the office quiet except for the hum of the servers in the next room, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing over the years he had spent building True Vector from nothing. He thought about the drivers scattered across 19 states, who had no idea their contracts were being weighed against a line item in a boardroom they would never enter. The platform had always been meant to find better routes, not to justify eliminating the people who drove them. The thought of it being turned into something that hurt the people it was supposed to serve settled in him like something he could not put down. Nina Radcliffe called Lawrence. 11 days later, her voice careful and unhurried. She had found evidence that Blackwell had quietly hired a former consultant who had done brief technical work with Ethan's company 2 years earlier. The contractor did not have the full source code, but he had spent enough time with True Vector's early architecture to help Blackwell reconstruct something dangerously similar, closely enough to drag Ethan into a patent dispute designed to outlast his company's operating budget. Serena intended to unveil the platform publicly as internally developed technology. She had already scheduled a press announcement. Ethan's engineers examined the access records on their development archive and found a pattern of requests that should not have been there. A third-party consulting account that had extracted structural documentation from a prototype build. The consultant, Boyd Rathmore, admitted under questioning that he had accepted the arrangement without understanding who was actually behind the company that retained him. Rather than terminating him immediately, Ethan asked Boyd to help map exactly what had been extracted and trace where it had gone. A cooperative witness, Lawrence reminded him, was worth more than a quiet dismissal. Embedded inside Blackwell's demonstration build was a sequencing signature Ethan had placed in an early True Vector prototype 3 years before Blackwell had ever contacted him. It was a habit from his engineering years, a small, invisible marker that no outside developer would have known to replicate. Its presence in Blackwell's code proved beyond reasonable dispute that the platform had been built from stolen material. Serena held a press conference and unveiled what she called Blackwell's proprietary routing intelligence, referring to Ethan publicly as a disgruntled hotel employee who had briefly mistaken himself for a technology founder. The line was covered widely. The mockery in the trade press was not subtle. The following week, Serena requested a meeting at the Meridian Grand, the same hotel, the same event floor, apparently believing the setting would re-establish the dynamic she had built there. She offered to purchase True Vector outright for $58 million, well below the original agreement's value, and to accompany the purchase with a public statement from Ethan that the gala incident had been a private matter unrelated to the negotiation. She was careful with her language throughout, precise enough to avoid any direct admission. Though Lawrence had advised Ethan to record the conversation, she was offering to buy his silence as cleanly as she had once tried to buy his compliance. Ethan declined. Xavier Trent approached Ethan privately 2 days later, claiming disillusionment with Serena and offering internal emails in exchange for guaranteed legal immunity and a private payment. Ethan referred him entirely to Lawrence's office and declined any direct arrangement. The following morning, Blackwell's communications team released an edited recording of the exchange that had been cut to suggest Ethan had initiated the contact and offered Xavier a bribe. Blackwell's board, watching the situation with mounting unease, began moving toward authorizing a full lawsuit against True Vector on multiple grounds. That evening, Nina Radcliffe sent Lawrence an audio file recovered from an internal executive strategy session. Use the IP dispute to drain his reserves, the Richard. Once his firm can't afford to litigate, the technology belongs to whoever can outlast him. The voice on the recording was unmistakably Serena Blackwell's. The board convened 2 weeks later to determine whether to authorize a lawsuit against Ethan Wyndham. Serena arrived fully confident, certain that Blackwell's legal and financial resources were sufficient to close the matter without further complication. When Ethan walked into the boardroom, wearing a plain dark suit, carrying only his phone and a single folder, Serena told the room, in front of the full board, that they had not assembled to hear from hotel staff. Ethan told her he understood exactly what kind of meeting it was, and that this time, she was the one waiting on someone else's decision. Lawrence presented the evidence in sequence, the workforce elimination appendix and the removed worker protections, the stolen architecture and the embedded sequence marker that proved it, the full, unedited footage of Xavier's approach, which showed clearly that he had initiated the contact, not Ethan, the audio of Serena ordering the use of the stolen material, and documentation proving the coordinated campaign against the Meridian Grand's bookings had originated from Blackwell's own communications firm. Serena insisted the recording had been altered. Xavier, sensing his own position collapsing, immediately confirmed that every instruction he had carried out had come directly from Serena. Nina Radcliffe stepped forward and confirmed she had preserved the unaltered recordings on Blackwell's own legal servers, removing any possibility they could be dismissed as fabricated. Several board members still hesitated. Losing access to True Vector entirely, they argued, would cost the company far more in the long run than resolving the situation with Ethan directly. Ethan let the silence hold for a moment before informing the room that the opportunity to acquire True Vector no longer existed for Blackwell at any price. He had signed an agreement that same morning. True Vector had reached a deal with the North Central Carrier Cooperative, a network of independent freight operators collectively representing more than 8,000 drivers across 19 states. The agreement was valued at $97 million. More importantly, it preserved every condition Ethan had always intended to enforce. No automated position eliminations during the first 3 years of deployment, a retraining fund for any driver whose route was restructured, a binding restriction against using True Vector's output as the sole basis for contract terminations, an ongoing audit right retained by Ethan's firm, over how the data was applied, and equity participation extended to the engineers who had built the platform from the beginning. He had not chosen the cooperative because the number was slightly higher. He had chosen it because he trusted True Vector would finally be used the way it was always meant to be used. The announcement sent Blackwell's competitive position into freefall. The board had not simply lost a licensing agreement. They had surrendered a strategic advantage to a rival network, and the person who had surrendered it was the man Serena had spent weeks publicly calling a hotel employee with an exaggerated sense of his own importance. Serena made one final attempt at the table, telling the board that Ethan had been fortunate, and that no amount of luck replaced the kind of professional judgment built over decades in the industry. Ethan looked at her and said that she still believed his uniform had been the most important thing about him, and that this belief was the clearest explanation for everything she had lost. The board voted to terminate Serena Blackwell with cause. She forfeited the performance bonuses tied to the international expansion program she had staked her tenure on, surrendered unvested equity, and lost all authority to represent Blackwell in future negotiations of any kind. Xavier Trent was terminated and placed under a separate investigation. Nina Radcliffe was formally entrusted with preserving every remaining piece of documentation connected to the matter. Serena walked out of the boardroom and attempted to issue instructions to her assistant in the corridor outside. No one in the building was required to follow them. The cooperative agreement pulled True Vector fully out of crisis within weeks. Ethan used part of the new funding to compensate the Meridian Grand for the revenue lost during the coordinated campaign against it, and he established a technical skills fund for service industry workers interested in transitioning into logistics and supply chain roles. He extended equity shares to the engineers who had remained with True Vector through the hardest months. Boyd Rathmore's cooperation in tracing the stolen material was weighed against the mistake that had made him available to Blackwell, and Ethan ensured his situation was handled with proportionality, rather than the clean termination that would have been simpler. Carol Delano offered Ethan a formal role on the Meridian Grand's Events Advisory Board, which he accepted. His only condition was that every person working the floor, regardless of how wealthy or important a guest believed themselves to be, was to be addressed with the same basic courtesy extended to anyone else in the room. Ethan still worked occasional shifts at the hotel, not to prove anything to anyone, and not as a performance of humility. Partly because he had started there when he needed it most, and partly because he had never once believed that carrying a tray made a person smaller than they were. The rhythm of that work had kept him grounded during the years when almost everything else had been uncertain, and he was not the kind of man who forgot what had held him up. Blackwell's incoming leadership issued a public apology to Ethan Wyndham and to the Meridian Grand several months later. Serena faced a wave of civil suits from shareholders in the period that followed. There was no prison sentence attached to her fall, only the long, quiet unraveling of a woman who had spent so many years converting other people's smaller circumstances into evidence of her own importance that she had forgotten the circumstances themselves meant nothing at all. 6 months after the board vote, Carol hosted a recognition dinner for service workers pursuing technical certifications, and Ethan came back for one shift by his own choosing, working the floor the way he had on hundreds of nights before any of this happened. Partway through the evening, Grace found him near the kitchen entrance and watched him carry a tray through the room with the same unhurried steadiness she had watched her whole life. She told him, half teasing and entirely serious, that she still did not fully understand why a man who had just signed a deal worth nearly $100 million wanted to spend a Saturday night serving appetizers at a hotel. Ethan handed off the tray, looked at her for a moment, and said there was a difference between being put somewhere by someone else's cruelty and choosing that same place for yourself. Grace turned that over on the drive home, the city sliding past the windows in long amber lines of streetlight, and she thought she understood what he meant, though she suspected she would keep understanding it more fully for years to come. At the far end of the room, just before Ethan had handed off the tray, a guest who did not know who he was had raised a hand impatiently to get his attention. The whole table had seemed to go quiet. The guest, feeling the weight of the room's collective attention shift toward him, had lowered his hand and offered a brief apology before Ethan could respond. Ethan had nodded and continued to the table without comment, completing the request the same way he completed all of them. Carol caught his eye from across the room and smiled, and neither of them said anything about how close everything had come to ending differently only months before. Near the front of the room, a screen displayed the first operational results from TrueVector's deployment across the cooperative network. Fuel costs down across all 19 states. 0 automated terminations. More than 400 drivers already enrolled in retraining programs. A functional appeals process that had already reversed 11 erroneous route flags on behalf of operators who would otherwise have had no recourse at all. Grace understood, looking at those numbers, that her father's victory had never really been about watching a CEO lose her position. He could have taken the $90 million and signed the agreement as written, and no one outside that boardroom would have known about the appendix until it was far too late for anyone to do anything about it. He had chosen not to, not because the outcome guaranteed him anything, but because the people who would have been harmed by it had no way of knowing they needed protecting. Serena Blackwell had been so certain that a man in a serving uniform occupied a fixed and permanent place, one defined by her assessment of his value, his station, and the distance between them. Ethan had spent 5 years quietly proving that the place a person holds is not written in what they wear or what they carry or what their labor costs per hour. It is decided, in ways that accumulate slowly and matter completely, by how a person treats someone else the moment they believe that person has nothing left to offer them in return. The dinner wound down slowly. The last guests gathered their things. The kitchen noise tapered off into the ordinary sounds of closing, dishes stacked, chairs set back in their proper positions, the lights above the bar turned up to full brightness. Ethan walked home with Grace that evening, the two of them moving through the neighborhood in easy silence, the sidewalks damp from an earlier rain, the air cool and clean the way it sometimes got, after a storm had finally passed through. He thought about Patricia, the way he still did on nights that felt complete in some quiet way he couldn't quite name. He thought about the years when this walk home had been the only uncomplicated thing left in his life. And he thought about how strange and how simple it was that the same hands which had spent years balancing trays and refilling water glasses had also built something that moved freight across half the country with more precision than anyone had thought possible. And that both things were true at once, and neither one erased the other. Dignity, he had come to understand, was not something another person handed you when they felt generous enough to grant it. It was what you kept intact on the nights when someone with far more power decided they wanted to take it, and it stayed intact not because you fought loudly for it, but because you never once agreed that it was theirs to remove.